Good morning. Thank you for joining SGI's webinar on a just transition. You should be entering on mute in listen only mode. If you are not muted, if you could mute yourself, that would be appreciated. There will be a Q&A session at the end where you'd be welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions. You can also enter questions in the chat throughout the webinar. As I said, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel afterwards if you would like to rewatch or share with others who are unable to attend. We have a great panel today, some great conversation, but before we start, I believe Chris is going to start us off with a short reflection. Chris, you are muted still.
Still making that rookie mistake after all that time in pandemic. This reflection comes from the conclusion to Pope Francis's book, Let Us Dream, and it's entitled Hope. When the storm has passed and the roads are tamed, and we are the survivors of a collective shipwreck, with tearful heart and our destiny blessed, we will feel joy simply for being alive. And we'll give a hug to the first stranger and praise our good luck that we kept a friend. And then we'll remember all that we lost and finally learned everything we never learned. And we'll envy no one, for all of us have suffered, and will not be idle, but more compassionate. We'll value more what belongs to all than what was earned. We'll be more generous and much more committed. We'll understand how fragile it is to be alive. We'll sweat empathy for those still with us and those who are gone. We'll miss the old man who asked for a buck in the market, whose name we never knew, who was always at your side. And maybe the poor old man was your God in disguise, but you never asked his name because you never had the time. And all will become a miracle, and all will become a legacy, and we'll respect the life we have gained. When the storm passes, I ask you, Lord, in shame, that you return us better as you once dreamed us.
Thank you, Chris. So today we have a few members joining us for our webinar on just transition, including Mary Hiebert from ICCR, Tom Content, and Sister Pegge Boehm. I'll first introduce Mary. She is the Associate Director on ICCR's Climate Change and Environmental Justice team. She works primarily on the Just Transition campaign. Before joining ICCR, Mary worked on equity and access issues in education, and most recently worked at the City University of New York, where she supported several programs and collaborative initiatives focused on increasing college access and success. Mary's going to start off today's presentation on the Just Transition. Thanks, Mary.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Natalie and the SGI team for having me and for hosting this conversation about Just Transition. Really good to be with you all. My plan is to share some lessons that we've learned at ICCR about supporting a just transition and to talk about what our work on this issue has looked like. I'll also try to set the context for this work by highlighting some just transition definitions and frameworks developed by different organizations that can help us understand what just transition means. So before I get into this context, this slide summarizes ICCR's goals and areas of focus for members' engagements on a just transition. Our just transition work has been centered on engagements with U.S. energy utilities in particular. ICCR members have a long history of engaging with utility companies, including on decarbonization goals. And by around 2018 or so, many of these engagements began to focus not just on decarbonization, but also on the social impacts of the energy transition, particularly for workers and communities. The Just Transition framework has been so helpful because it links support for necessary climate action with commitments to address these social impacts that come with the transition to clean energy. And it allows us to have a conversation about how companies can be ensuring that impacted workers and communities are central to decarbonization planning. As noted in the last point of this particular slide, a key aspect of our approach in just transition engagements has been to strive to be informed by impacted stakeholders. So ICCR has tried to support the development of place-based relationships with workers and community organizations in the service areas of the utilities that members are engaging, which looks different for different engagements, but important to mention here. Near the end of my remarks, I'll also talk about an ICCR-led investor statement and a recent Just Transition roundtable that we hosted, which have also offered opportunities for us to hear at more of a national level from a range of community and labor stakeholders about their visions for a just transition. Okay, next slide, please. So before I talk more about ICCR, I'm going to zoom out for a moment to highlight some important places in which just transition is mentioned and defined. So I'm hoping that this will communicate two things. One is that there has been momentum building over the last several years, including in the investor community, to engage on just transition issues. There are definitely an increasing number of frameworks and tools and reports out there, only some of which I'll mention today, that have been developed to help define just transition goals and actions. And then second, that the term just transition can and does mean different things to different people and organizations. So there isn't one single definition of it to which all stakeholders refer. It's been important for us at ICCR as an investor coalition to be aware of and to continue to educate ourselves about the visions for a just transition that are out there, and then how we can best understand these as we engage with companies. Okay, next slide. So first, in terms of places where the just transition is mentioned and where the importance of it is affirmed, one important one is the Paris Agreement from 2015, as noted here. In the agreement, there is an acknowledgement of the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. And there's a recognition that when taking action to address climate change, as noted here, there's a need for taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems. Next slide, please. Also in 2015, the International Labor Organization released its guidelines for a just transition. These guidelines define the 4 pillars of the decent work agenda, so social dialogue, social protection, rights at work, and employment, as listed here, as indispensable to sustainable development. And they argue that well-managed, quote, transitions to environmentally and socially sustainable economies can become a strong driver of job creation, job upgrading, social justice, and poverty eradication, quote. So these guidelines are about 17 pages long or so, and as defined by the ILO, are both a policy framework and a practical tool to help countries at all levels of development manage the transition. They were put together following what's called an ILO tripartite meeting of experts that reflects the view of governments, employers, and workers' organizations. So these guidelines are a key internationally recognized framework for a just transition, and I think they're a particularly important reference point for understanding the labor perspective. I'll also note here in terms of resources that the ILO has a frequently asked questions on just transition webpage that's got some really helpful information if folks want to learn more. Okay, next slide. So this slide shows another really important just transition framework developed by the US-based Climate Justice Alliance with the support of Movement Generation. The Climate Justice Alliance builds on the work of frontline communities who have been part of the environmental justice movement for decades. And it provides this kind of clear analysis and framework for a just transition. They define just transition as, quote, a vision-led, unifying, and place-based set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, unquote. So this is a holistic definition of a just transition that really lays out a vision for a transformation of the economy. This framework centers the experiences of frontline communities and their visions for change, so it's really a critical resource for anyone or organization seeking to advance a just transition. I'll also recommend here that the resources available on the Climate Justice Alliance webpage that are about this just transition framework, so the link is available on this slide and afterwards, I believe, includes a lot of other information, like more information about history and context and a set of just transition principles. So also recommend that. Next slide. As we think about our role as an investor network engaging on just transition issues, I also wanted to highlight two sets of benchmarks that have been developed in the last several years to measure companies' performance against just transition indicators. This kind of measurement can be particularly challenging because of the ways in which the just transition is at the intersection of a pretty complex set of social and environmental considerations. So having these kind of indicators can provide useful anchors, if you will, for engaging with companies on the specifics of what just transition involves. So on this slide are the World Benchmarking Alliance, or WBA's, just transition indicators. In 2021, they did a pilot assessment of 180 companies in high emitting sectors against these indicators. So they focus on, as you can see here, social dialogue and stakeholder engagement, planning for a just transition, green and decent job creation, retraining or upskilling, social protection and social impact management, and advocacy for policies and regulation supporting a just transition. Next slide. So on this slide are newly finalized just transition indicators that are now part of the Climate Action 100+ net zero company benchmark. So folks may be well aware, but CA 100+ uses this benchmark to assess the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters on their net zero transition. And they're meant to be an evaluation tool for investor engagement. In 2022, CA 100+ integrated a just transition indicator in beta form into its benchmark for the first time. And then this past March, after public consultation, they released their 2.0 benchmark, which includes this finalized official just transition indicator shown on this slide. These are meant to align with the WBA JT indicators, so I think you'll see some common threads. In terms of how this indicator is structured, you'll see that the left column has to do with commitments that a company makes to just transition. So these include like retraining, redeploying, or compensating workers affected by decarbonization efforts, and developing new projects associated with decarbonization in consultation with affected communities. And then on the right side, that has to do with disclosures the company makes about how it's planning and monitoring just transition progress. So this includes, one example, a metric about companies developing a just transition plan in consultation with workers, communities, and other key stakeholders. Next slide. So before moving on to ICCR's work, I wanted to give a nod to the number of other resources out there for investors who are thinking about how they're approaching and supporting a just transition. The resource highlighted on this slide is from 2018 and was developed by the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at LSE and the Initiative for Responsible Investment at Harvard. This guide outlines how investors can pursue just transition goals and include some models for thinking about motivations for investor engagement in this area and areas for particular investor action. And some of those graphics are shown on this slide. Also, another plug, the Grantham Research Institute is another good spot to go for additional reports on just transition. They have another one from 2021 that focuses on translating just transition ambitions into investor action. And then they have a recent report from the fall of 2022 about how to embed the just transition specifically into financial sector net zero plans. So recommend those as well. Okay, next slide. So I'll turn back now to ICCR's work on just transition, and I'm going to highlight an investor statement that we coordinated, as well as some key learnings from a recent roundtable on the just transition that we hosted in January. Thanks. So this slide captures some key points from this investor statement on job standards and community impacts in the just transition that ICCR coordinated and released in 2022. To put this statement together, ICCR went through a lengthy consultation process with stakeholders from a variety of groups, including labor groups, environmental justice groups, and community-based organizations, as well as with investor members. So this statement helps to do a couple things. I think one, to demonstrate investor support for just transition goals, and then also to define specific expectations for companies around just transition actions. These expectations are laid out in the 5 principles that are shown here, which are providing a foundation for decent work, job benefits, and working conditions, offering equitable opportunities for quality jobs, investing in impacted communities, facilitating transparency and accountability, including through something like a formal stakeholder engagement process, and supporting just transition policies at all levels. This statement got a lot of support. It was signed by nearly 100 investors representing over 4 trillion in assets, and members have continued to use it to help guide conversations with companies and stakeholders around what we mean by just transition. Okay. Next slide. Another highlight from ICCR's recent work in this area is a multi-stakeholder just transition roundtable that we hosted over 2 days in January. I'm going to give folks a chance just to read through the goal of that event for a moment on the slide. So at this event, participants came together to share their perspectives on what a just and equitable energy transition looks like, with a focus on how a just transition in the build out of clean energy can be achieved in practice and with the meaningful engagement of workers and communities. The roundtable was designed as an opportunity for open dialogue among investors and representatives from businesses and energy utility companies, labor organizations, community-based organizations, energy and environmental justice groups, ratepayer associations, and public and private entities focused on energy research and policy. ICCR also partnered, worth noting, with 2 external organizations to plan the roundtable, Emerald Cities Collaborative and RMI also played the role of facilitators at the event. I'll note here that this was the 2nd Just Transition Roundtable that ICCR hosted. ICCR hosted an initial roundtable in 2019 in partnership with the Initiative for Responsible Investment. The 2023 roundtable was designed to advance the conversation from 2019 in a few particular ways. So in 2019, the roundtable was focused on the transition away from fossil fuel-based energy production, so on things like coal plant closures. And then the 2023 roundtable was designed to focus more on the renewable energy build-out. Secondly, for the 2023 event, we also tried more intentionally to bring in environmental justice or energy justice perspectives, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment, in addition to labor perspectives to help us define just transition. Okay, next slide. I'll describe some of the key messages we heard from participants at the roundtable. These perspectives and recommendations that we heard are helping us at ICCR, I think through how we can move forward with our support as an investor coalition for just transition. So my hope is that there'll be some useful reflections to share with this group for consideration too. First, as you see here, we heard the message that cross-stakeholder dialogue and meaningful stakeholder engagement in the energy transition are critical. We heard that spaces like the roundtable are opportunities for a broad range of stakeholders in the energy transition to come together, share experiences and information were too rare, and that there's currently a lack of infrastructure for this kind of social dialogue. Energy and environmental justice stakeholders particularly named the importance of including BIPOC communities at the decision-making table, and labor stakeholders named the importance of including workers themselves, so both direct employees and contracted workers in transition conversations. We also heard from multiple corners about the need to better align utility incentives with a just transition. In particular, the role of regulatory processes in determining these incentives came up a lot. And there was a lot of interest in better understanding regulatory frameworks and examples of performance-based regulation. And then lastly, we heard from a variety of stakeholders that there's a need for shared and better just transition data, metrics, and benchmarks. So there's a particular interest, I think, in transparency around the measurement of things like energy disparities and household burden, and in the measurement of labor practices. Next slide. When we talk about just transition, we often talk about putting workers and communities at the center of climate transition planning. So I wanted to highlight some specific things we heard from representatives of labor and frontline communities at the roundtable. On this slide are some messages that labor stakeholders emphasized. So first, the shift from the old energy economy, if you will, to the new energy economy has in some cases meant a shift from well-paid jobs with good benefits and things like a collective bargaining agreement fought for by workers and unions over many years to significantly lower wage work with no protections. So labor stakeholders have emphasized the need to ensure that the energy transition also enables the creation of high road jobs with fair compensation, benefits, and safe working conditions. We also heard about the need to include all workers in the transition process. For example, direct employees of utilities, as well as employees of contractors that utilities are working with. The next slide. From participants at community-based organizations and those oriented around like environmental and energy justice concerns, we heard that the current energy system is built on injustice. So it's essential to address the just transition in the context of this injustice and past harms caused, with particular consideration for the disproportionate harms the energy economy has caused BIPOC communities. Relatedly, we heard about the need for representational governance and decision-making about the energy transition. The importance of working towards energy justice and energy democracy was a recurring theme. So I thought I'd spend a moment on defining the term energy justice, which was key to discussions at the roundtable and had been introduced to participants there during one of our virtual pre-roundtable workshops that was facilitated by our partners at Emerald Cities Collaborative. So as noted here and defined by the Initiative for Energy Justice, the term energy justice refers to, quote, the goal of achieving equity in both social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating social, economic, and health burdens on those historically harmed by the energy system. They go on to explain that energy justice explicitly centers the concerns of marginalized communities and aims to make energy more accessible, affordable, clean, and democratically managed for all communities. So that's a quote from the Initiative for Energy Justice. I'll say again here that there's a lot of additional useful information accessible on the link on this slide at the Initiative for Energy Justice. I'll give a really small example that they have a graphic that depicts the just transition as encompassing climate justice, environmental justice, and energy justice concerns. So I found that helpful in thinking through the relationship among those considerations. Okay, next slide. So that was a peek into some of the issues that came up at ICCR's recent roundtable, and I'll close here by summarizing what's coming up next for us. First, we have documented the lessons learned from hosting the roundtable, as well as recommendations shared by participants in a report that will be publicly available shortly. We hope this will be useful for a variety of audiences, including investors, of course, and we'll share that link widely as soon as it's available. And second, ICCR plans to host a limited series of informational webinars focused on topics surfaced at the roundtable. These will be open to a big multi-stakeholder group, including roundtable participants, as well as other investors and partners in ICCR's network. The first webinar takes up the importance of understanding regulatory frameworks, as I had mentioned, that can influence a just transition. And this session is going to focus on performance-based regulation in support of a just energy transition. Everyone here is certainly welcome to attend that webinar. I will leave a link to the registration form in the chat. And then lastly, just a bigger picture comment that in the short and long term, ICCR is committed to continued work with companies and stakeholders on a just transition. So we'll look forward to continued conversation with this group and others about how to most meaningfully support that work. All right, that's it for me. Back to you, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Mary, for starting us off and really providing all of that insight on the work that ICCR and others are doing on the just transition. And we'll get into some of those engagements, experience, and investor viewpoint a little bit later on. First, though, to continue the conversation, I'm going to introduce Tom Content. He is the Executive Director of the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin, which is the nation's first CUB formed in 1979. CUB is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, and independent consumer advocate for the residential and small business utility customers of Wisconsin. CUB advocates for fair and affordable utility rates and reliable and safe utility service in cases decided by the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin, and provides outreach and education to residential and small business customers. Tom joined the Citizens Utility Board in 2017 after working for 30 years as a journalist, including 20 years tracking the Wisconsin energy and utility sector while reporting in Milwaukee and Green Bay. In 2007, he won a National Press Foundation Stokes Award for top energy writing in the country for a series of articles in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Tom also sits on the 7th Generation Board, and Tom's going to take us into the next part of the conversation.
Super. Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And I thought what I would do here today is trying to show how our engagements look like, the engagements that the ratepayer organization, the consumer advocate organizations are like with the regulated utilities, and how they're maybe a bit similar and or different from the work on the investor side of ICCR and SGI. And then our work toward where our work intersects with the movement for a just transition. Next slide, please. So we are basically in the monopoly system that every state regulates the monopoly utilities, and in a way that's designed to reflect fairness, as well as and we're set the prices at a level that approximates what it would look like in a competitive world. But there's a lot of influence that the utilities have in terms of political power, et cetera. And so the goal of having a strong consumer advocate, is to level that playing field where the key decisions are made. And our work has saved customers billions over the years, just in terms of bringing down the rates, the proposals to increase rates, or also having the regulators reject new proposals that either aren't needed or aren't economic. We're also a member and active in the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. So we dialogue with consumer advocates across the country, there are most about 44 out of 46 of states have an organization, whether it's a state agency or a CUB or a different kind of nonprofit that does this work on behalf of consumers. So that people who don't have a voice gain a voice in the proceedings at the state level, because that's where in our system, the state is where a lot of action happens in terms of the decisions that are made. Next slide, please. And so for us, and it's actually evolved in recent years. Hiebert and Isuka both were happy to join ICCR at the roundtable 4 years ago in 2019. And I was happy to represent CUB and Isuka at the ICCR roundtable in January as well. But for us, there's some critical things that need to happen to help to think about what consumers need. And what consumers need is affordable energy rates as we go through this transition, and part of that is through the saving on utilities can profit for years after those coal plants are shut down, and we don't, both in Wisconsin and around the country. And then also looking toward performance-based regulation, so that the incentive, and essentially an easy way to think about that is, right now the utilities are incentivized to build. Basically, the more they build, the more they earn, and the more our costs go up. But that can be reset in a way that they are given incentives for keeping rates affordable, for considering organized labor and their concerns, for working with communities when coal plants shut down, for increasing energy efficiency, for increasing the ability of customers to incentivizing customers to put solar on their own roofs. So you could actually enable what PBR, or performance-based regulation, does is actually enables those things to happen. And then what we're doing a lot in recent years, and now in partnership with some low-income and BIPOC organizations as well, is focusing on affordability and tackling household energy burden, because there's an average price that everybody pays across the entire state, but an average bill of $100 a month means a lot. It's a lot different for somebody making $10,000 a month versus somebody who's making $1,000 per month. Next slide, please. So just to take you inside one case, which was last year's case, we really raised some of these issues in conjunction. And for the first time, there was a BIPOC advocate in the rate case at the Public Service Commission. So in the Lindsay Heights neighborhood of Milwaukee, 85 to 90% of that community is African American, and 45% of that community, that neighborhood, Milwaukee neighborhood, is below the poverty line. So they actually came in and helped raise the awareness of the challenge that low-income customers are facing. And through our work, we were focusing on the profit side and how out of whack the utility profits are, and this problem of how the incentives for utilities are not the way how they need to be reset. Next slide, please. And so we have a stat. So in these cases at the commissions around the country, the utilities come in with their hired guns, if you will, they're experts who provide testimony in these quasi-judicial proceedings. And so what we do as the consumer advocate is we have our own experts. So this is a picture of my lead economist who has 40 years of experience in finance and economics and utility regulation. And so he's now working for us and other consumer advocates as well, to go up against those utilities and convince the state, the decision makers at the state government level, that there needs to be a reset. So good picture of Steve there. All right, next slide, please. And so our experts are weighing in both last year and this year. And there was a study that came out that we included in Steve's testimony that showed that even apart from focusing on, that just showed that customers across the country are overpaying by billions of dollars per year just toward profits that in part because those incentives haven't been reset. Next slide, please. And so, focus. So on the just transition, as I said, we had that initial our initial focus, say when I first joined CUB, was on the coal plant shutdowns and saving customers when those plants are shut down, so that we can have a more cost-effective transition to cleaner energy sources. And a corollary and now emerging area of focus for us is really focusing on reducing household energy burden. And this was highlighted during the pandemic when because of the health crisis, there were no disconnections were allowed of utility customers. It didn't make sense to have warming places where people could congregate when they were warming if you couldn't congregate because of COVID. So they didn't allow any disconnections throughout the public health emergency. And that ended up placing a spotlight on what can be done to help people who are struggling with their bills. And so what we've started to advocate was let's track energy burden in a more granular way. So let's find out where the problems are. We know that poverty is happening in our big cities, but poverty is also happening in the rural parts of the state. So let's get more information. And so after we urged that, the state actually required the utilities to file annual energy burden reports with the Wisconsin Commission as part of their annual reports. So that was one step forward that happened a couple of years ago. Next slide, please. And so what we're seeing is that this shows that on the north side and near north side and near south side of Milwaukee, how the energy burden picture is much more draconian. And basically, an household energy burden is essentially defined as the percent of your income that goes toward your household energy costs. And just as a rule of thumb is that if it's over 6%, then you're struggling. And you can see on this chart that we have areas that are well over it and into the double digits in terms of the percentage of their household income that are being spent on their energy bills. Next slide, please. And so because the utilities started measuring it, now they're producing these reports. That first, the slide, the picture on the last slide was actually based on a national study that was about 5 years old, and it was the best information we had. But now we're getting more granular data submitted now by our utilities. And so this is just one of the utilities, not even the largest utility in the state, but they were able to produce their own heat map in a report that was just filed this month with the Public Service Commission. So they're, and it comes back to the old adage, which you see in the headline: if you don't measure it, how can you manage it, right? So now, because they're managing it, we're seeing responses. Next slide, please. And so we're seeing responses in a variety of ways. Both Alliant and WEC, the two utilities serving the eastern side of Wisconsin, launched forgiveness programs for customers who are behind on their bills, where if they can get back on and pay, even if they don't pay their entire bill, they'll get back on a regular cycle of paying, and then their overdue balances will be forgiven over time. That's one example, and we collaborated with utilities to help create those. And then just this year, you can see this percentage of income pilot is what other states have that Wisconsin does not have yet, but we've been negotiating with utilities to try to bring these forward in Wisconsin. And so we have one utility, Xcel Energy, that has proposed one in March, and then now the state in Madison, the Public Service Commission is studying whether to expand that and include the Milwaukee area, the Green Bay area, and the entire eastern side of this state in the utility for those utilities. And so that would enable to bring down that energy burden by basically providing a credit on your bill if your income is below a certain level. And then, even though they're not proposing the same type of concepts, both we have 5 investor-owned utilities in the state, and so the other 2, the ones based in Madison, which are Alliant Energy and Madison Gas and Electric, MGE Energy, are both also putting forward new proposals just in recent weeks to assist with low-income customers, provide adders or credits, and in one case, Madison Gas and Electric doing something that nobody else is trying, which is trying to reach the people who are struggling, who just barely don't qualify for energy assistance because their income is just above that, and but they are still struggling even if they don't get federal energy assistance credit payments through the federal LIHEAP program. So we're seeing that because they're measuring it, they want to see they're now developing. They're all developing ideas for how to attack these problems, which is great to see. Next slide, please. So then what do you measure? How do you measure it? There are 2 different, the Energy Equity Project came out with a report last year that from Michigan State that talks about has a whole series of metrics. And so I put the link on there for folks to look at after, and go to that link later. And then through NSUCA, which is our consumer advocate organization, we developed a series of metrics, and a resolution in November that basically urged the PSCs around the country and utilities to measure about 40 different discrete areas, all with an eye toward making sure that we're focused on affordability and focused on not just affordability, but on BIPOC communities and that have been subject to longstanding redlining and other challenges, to ensure that we're focused on that, and so there are plenty of new initiatives, and I think this is an issue that came up, a discussion that was actively part of the discussions we had at the ICCR Just Transition Roundtable in January. And then it's just so important to have more voices at the table. For too long, the most states, including Wisconsin, haven't had BIPOC or low-income advocates at the Public Service Commission actively representing their communities. We've started to see that in Wisconsin, which is very encouraging. And we're seeing that now there's actually a new statewide energy justice, environmental justice infrastructure initiative that's going to try to be expanding that. And if you have more voices at the table, better things can happen. So that's a quick dive into what's going on in Wisconsin on some of these issues, and I appreciate the chance to talk with you about that today and look forward to any questions.
Thanks so much, Tom, for giving us that insight and viewpoint on everything, especially happening in our state of Wisconsin. I want to switch into kind of the investor viewpoint on this work as well. SGI members engage a lot of the Midwestern utilities on both just transition and a variety of other climate issues, including MGE, Alliant, CMS, Excel, and DTE, among others, throughout Wisconsin, throughout the upper Midwest. And so to speak on that is Sister Pegge Boehm. She is a presentation sister with the Aberdeen, South Dakota congregation and is the SRI coordinator for her congregation. She currently serves on their leadership team and recently joined the SGI board. And in her words, her community relies on the collaboration with SGI to be effective shareholder advocates. So thank you, Pegge, for giving us your investor viewpoint and work on this just transition.
Okay, thank you, Natalie, and for asking me. My presentation here this morning is, I would like to say it's kind of a work in progress, and it's also a quest that I've always been focused on, is how, as people of faith, what is our work to do? What is the perspective we bring to dialogues with companies? So my goal then today is, to understand just transition through our lens of faith, and then to share my experience as an investor working with SGI, and highlight in a way how a company that we engage with, which is CMS, has put their faith in action. So it's a different way to think about just transition. I'd like to just start out with some definitions of some words, especially in light of the title, Just Transition Through the Lens of a Faithful Stockholder. First of all, the word justice. Biblical justice, as we understand it, means to make right. It's a relational term, and it's about people living in right relationship with God, one another, and creation. I'd like to add not just people, but companies and other entities living in right relationship. The word transition, we think of that as changing from one state to another. I'd like to add another word of a goal, in terms of transition. We're working with a company, in their transition, but our goal is transformation. And I think we see that as we work in just transition work, that this is a seismic shift from a fossil fuel based economy, an extractive economy, to a clean energy economy, a regenerative economy, one that's sustainable and one that's just or in right relationship, company with people, company with workers, company with communities, company with creation. So it's looking at the meaning of just transition in light of our faith. So next slide, please. Yes, I've just been taken by the mission statement of SGI recently, and the SGI mission statement is to build a more just and sustainable world for those most vulnerable by integrating social and environmental values into corporate and investor actions. So I was wondering, value, well, what might those values be? And recently, I received, and maybe you do too, some information from Interfaith Power and Light. They're faith-based, and each week during Faith Climate Action Week, they have a theme. And the theme that they had this year was Living the Golden Rule, Faith in Action for Just Transition. And as we call ourselves interfaith, I have this quest to find out to seek out what might be that moral, ethical compass that cuts through all faith perspectives, not just the Catholic, not just the Christian, but all faith perspectives. And I thought, when I read that, I thought the golden rule, yes, we all espouse that, all of the religions. We might know that do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I'd like to add do unto creation as well. So in this slide, this is the golden rule as we look at all of the ways different faiths talk about it. The golden rule is for example, the first one, act with inclusion and mutual. If you want people to treat you with respect, then you should treat them with respect. So when you talk about just transition, yes, we heard in the speakers before, we want to inclusion, all the voices, especially those who are impacted by the transition. And it's about respecting each one with the other. And I won't go, you can just kind of take a minute and read those. So all of our faith traditions call us to care for one another and our earth. And in this slide, we see that when we're talking about loving our neighbors, it really, and especially in terms of economics, we talk about ecological well-being, social well-being, and economic well-being. And if you have all those in right relationship, the result is sustainability, when all are in harmony. So we want ecological well-being for our common home, clean air and clean water and clean soil. We want social well-being where the workers who are impacted by the transition are involved in the decision-making, as well as the communities. And economic well-being, yes, we want just profits for the company, as well as communities not being negatively impacted. And I just want to conclude that one with, in Laudato Si, paragraph 138, the word that Pope Francis uses, the integral ecology, where all is connected, all is interrelated. And so we need, as we solve these complicated issues, we need an integrated approach. Next slide, please. As I said, we engage with CMS Energy and have for a long time. And it is definitely a mutual relationship. I just want to say too, the other word that came to me here as we talk, a utility company. When you look at the root meaning of company, it means sharing bread together, coming together. We might know it as inviting company over to the house for dinner. And in a sense, we're companions. We're companions with the company. We kind of come together with the company. We break bread, we share our stories, and we hopefully leave mutually enriched. So I just wanted to bring that to the table too, just thinking about that word company and how we're related to that as companions with that company in our engagements. CMS Energy is one of those that we look up to as a leader in the field. I was deeply moved in one of our dialogues. They asked us, what is meant by environmental justice? And you'll notice that they're adopting a EPA tool, environmental justice screening tool. And it was really a challenge, both to me, and I think it was Frank Sherpin was on that call, helping us, what is meant by environmental justice? And I really appreciated Tom and Mary's presentations today, which really helped me understand that a little bit more as well. So the other thing here is that they hold stakeholder meetings in communities. So there, again, the communities that are impacted are included in the discussions about how they are imagining their transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. And the last piece was a concern. Now that you would think, well, that's a good thing. There's these renewable energy companies coming to the state. However, it was very interesting to hear that because we know that CMS Energy is being faithful to these principles of just transition, that they saying that some of these fly-by-night companies don't often care about the people impacted in the communities. So next slide, please. And this one here, yes, in the so they're very much a leader and very assertive in their actions. They're made a commitment that in the 2020s, this is what they're about, deploying renewable energy. So the other thing that they're facing when they go to communities, because they do go and they talk to the people, that they're facing anti-solar campaigns. And again, we had a conversation with them, how do you navigate that kind of rhetoric and, maybe find common ground. And all these other ones, you can read there. That's, again, some of their accolades. Next slide. Okay, so this is the last slide. They have a clean energy plan and a scope 3 action plan. Well, what is a scope 3? Well, most utilities don't include scope 3 emissions in their climate goals of net zero projections. One utility found that 77% of its scope 3 emissions stems from consumer use of its power. So it's mostly consumer use of its power. So anyway, there in March 22, the SEC required companies to report scope 3 emissions if they were material to their business. So they're very aggressive, and like Tom said, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So I thought that was a good phrase. In conclusion, I'd just like to say, as people of faith and as shareholders engaging companies in just transition, to clean energy production, that we all share in common the golden rule, which calls us to care for one another and our common home. We are companions with the company. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Peggy, Tom, and Mary, for everything you shared today. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I think we're all okay with that, knowing all of the great information that was shared today. So we do still have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you have questions, if you'd either like to come off mute and ask them yourselves or pop that into the chat box, you're more than welcome to do either. So opening it up to anybody on the call with any questions for our speakers today.
Maybe I'll just throw a soft one both to Sister Peggy and to Natalie. Given that we are all from organizations that use utilities simply because of the fact that we're online right now, can you talk about some of the steps of how others can join these engagements?
Well, first of all, I'd say if you or your organization has any interest in wanting to reverse the climate crisis and to be a contributor, proactive in that effort, that if you have shares in an energy company, all I have to say is that SGI has been just wonderful. They do their homework. They help navigate dialogues with companies in a professional way. And so don't be afraid, but take advantage, not take advantage, but partner with SGI to make a difference in this world.
Thanks, Peggy. And I'll add to that, if you're an SGI member or ICCR member or part of any other coalition, SGI works, as I mentioned, in a handful of Midwestern utilities. We're a part of ICCR and help with those just transition engagements, also through series and the Climate Action 100+. So there are a variety of different ways to join different engagements, and also connecting with Citizens Utility Board and other organizations locally to learn more about other impacts of utilities. I give one other minute for any other questions that people may have today. And if not, I just want to thank you all for joining us today on this great webinar on just transition. Thank you again to Mary, Tom, and Peggy. I personally thought this was great, so hope everybody else viewing did as well. The slides and resources will be posted on our website afterwards. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if they're for a specific individual on the call, we can always reach out to them as well with those questions that you may have. So thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.